Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. This week's episode is one that I've been looking forward to for a very long time. I am talking to Andrew Blauvelt. Over the course of Andrew's career, he has worked as a designer, educator, curator, and writer. Since 2015, he's been the director of the Cranbrook Art Museum, but before that, he worked at the Walker Art Center since 1998, where he held a variety of positions, including design director, chief of communication and audience engagement, and senior curator of design, research, and publishing. And previously, he was the director of the graduate studies and chair of the graphic design department at North Carolina State University. Andrew is someone whose work I've admired for basically my entire design career, and I've just really enjoyed watching the evolution of his career as he straddles practice and academia, curating and communications. He really just embodies this idea of expanded practice and truly is one of my favorite thinkers in and around design. And so in this conversation, Andrew and I talk about all of that. We go all the way back to where his interest in design started and retrace the steps of his career. We talk about what a museum director does and how design influences how he thinks about that job, and that background that he has kind of gives him a unique perspective in this job, as well as how the general design discourse has changed over the course of his career. If you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year to receive an exclusive monthly newsletter that has additional content and episode previews. Those memberships really help keep the podcast going, and I just appreciate all of your support and hope that you enjoy this conversation with Andrew Blauvelt. Somebody that I have been reading and someone whose work I've been interested in for basically my entire design career, my entire interest in design. And when I got interested in design, you were already at the Walker, but you had a career before that, and I would love to talk about that just a little bit, just to kind of understand your background a little bit. So how did you get interested in graphic design, or where did that that idea come from?
Well, it was in the dark ages.
Okay.
No one knew what graphic design was, really. So pre-computer. So
Right.
This would have been in the early 80s. So in high school, I was involved in the newspaper and yearbook.
Okay.
And more on the production end, not the writing end. And so I actually gained a lot of skills, technical skills, by doing that kind of work,
Right.
like how to spec typesetting, how to paste up things, like all the old stuff that you don't.
Right.
So the seed must have been planted there. I guess for doing that, I've always been interested in art, and then, but I kind of did a dual track. So I was more like, I guess it always sounds diametrically opposed, but academic, in track in high school. Essentially. And so, but I've always taken art classes. So I guess I secretly wanted to be an artist or a designer, but, I was tracking towards, I don't know, I think poli-sci and law.
Interesting. Oh, wow. Okay. So how did you but thinking about those two sides, I have two questions around that. How did you decide graphic design? And then two, and maybe this is the bigger and more interesting question, how did you figure out, or when were you introduced to graphic design as a field or as a thing that you could actually do as a career? Where did that come from?
Well, I think that came when I left high school, I was actually enrolled in poli-sci.
Okay.
But I never really started, because in the summer, I discovered the local art school, which would have been the Heron School of Art in Indianapolis.
Okay. Are you from Indiana?
I grew up there. I'm originally from New York, though.
Oh, okay.
So, Yeah.
I was born in Indianapolis and spent some of my childhood in Lafayette, Indiana.
Yeah, Purdue,
Okay.
Purdue territory.
Yeah, that's right. I didn't realize that you had lived there.
Yeah, there's a lot of designers from there.
Yeah.
I think I keep discovering more and more people. So I was tracking to go into, kind of academic role, and then I discovered a pre-college summer workshop at the art school, and I took that course because I had not taken a lot of art classes, like enough to make a portfolio.
Right.
I think things are a lot different today, but back in the day, it was really hard to get into art school, actually.
Yeah.
And it was all about the portfolise, and
right.
They basically didn't really, they looked at SATs and stuff like that, but just to make sure that you knew how to read. But otherwise, it's all about the work. And I was not tracked in that kind of program, so I didn't develop a portfolio. So I thought, well, this is, so for some reason I took that workshop, and then I got, I think I did well in it. And so then they gave me a deferment, basically. They gave me a free pass into art school. So I just switched schools.
Oh, wow.
To art school. And then I had, there were designers teaching it, which I think might also be a little unusual because I think it's usually artists that teach that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But two designers, like somebody graduating from the undergraduate program was the kind of helper instructor. And then one of the professors was a design professor. And so I remember looking or seeing the graduating student, the senior, I guess, or the recent graduate, I guess, showed his portfolio, and that was all graphic design related. Right. And then I thought, oh, I like this. Like it connected with what I had been doing in high school. So, I thought, well, this seems much more fun.
Right.
So then I got a free pass into art school. So then I signed up, and then we had a foundation year where you don't have a major. So we just studied basic principles and things, and then took a little bit of painting, a little bit of sculpture, a little bit of design, that kind of stuff. And then I just tracked right into the graphic design program, which allowed you to also there were sub-tracks. So you had to do either something more akin to illustration or photography, I chose photography. So I actually studied fine art photography and graphic design.
Oh, interesting. And what, it's really interesting to hear this because it's similar to my story, and in discovering graphic design, being interested in the arts. I was really interested in architecture as a kid. I always was kind of interested in drawing and things like that, but never felt like being an artist was what I wanted to do. And when I discovered graphic design, suddenly all of these things I was interested in really came together, and it just immediately felt like, oh yeah, this is the thing that I have been wanting to do. This pulls together everything. Did you feel that when you kind of got into that track, that all of these things you were interested in were feeling right?
Yeah, definitely. That it was a creative endeavor, and it was what was interesting in undergrad is that it was also intellectual endeavor.
Oh, okay.
So it's never a trade school.
Oh, interesting.
But it was I learned so much technically. Of course, it was a different universe back then, but it was very technical, but it was not anti-intellectual at all. So it was just a weird program. It was
yeah. I mean, that sounds really interesting. What was the intellectual side at that time?
There was a lot of history, which was new because graphic design history, like Meg's book had just come out, the first edition. So that was being used actually by the instructors. But we didn't have graphic design history. But oddly, I had type history. Oh,
weird. Okay.
Yeah, and for 2 semesters of it, and it was incorporated into the type 1 and type 2 classes. So it was just really, and then I don't know, through osmosis or something, I knew about some basic design history because I remember, now that you're judging all this up.
Yeah, sorry to go back that far.
like psychoanalysis or something. So with the kid, I was trying to remember his name now. I can't remember his name now, but the graduating student who was the instructor in the pre-college workshop, he had done poster on I think the Bauhaus or something. So this is that period when design students were researching design history, which really meant doing a lot of research because there wasn't a lot. There would have been a lot on the Bauhaus, of course, but
right.
But I remember knowing what the Bauhaus was, and they were shocked. But but I did live in Germany for like 3 years.
Oh, okay.
That might have helped. I don't know. Probably.
I mean,
but somebody knew about it.
That is amazing. I feel like
I got the pass into school.
Right. I don't mean to be too reductive here, but I feel like hearing that actually explains a lot about how your career has turned out. And I don't mean to draw too many connections between the two of us, but I feel like your early design education was, again, similar to my own in that, like I said before we started recording, my introduction to graphic design was through blogs. And then, from there I was reading Looking Closer. And so when I ended up going to undergrad for graphic design, I knew a lot of graphic design history. I knew a lot of theory, but I didn't know any of the practical side. I didn't know what kerning was. I didn't know how to set up a text file or a template file in, I guess at the time that was PageMaker. And I've only after the fact realized that it was because of that early kind of education in the theory and the history that my view of graphic design was kind of shaped in that way. And so when you finished undergrad, you went right to Cranbrook, right? Or did you work in between there? No, I went right from undergrad, which was very unusual. Yeah, why did you do that?
To escape Indiana.
Okay, that's a good answer. I've been there.
Yeah. Well, I think it's much better today, just culturally, but things to do. I had a very excellent undergraduate education, though, so you can't knock that. But how I wanted to practice and what I wanted to practice in design, I just didn't see it there. And then everyone oddly seemed to want to stay in Indiana, and I am a military brat, so I moved around all my life. Okay. So I just understood that impulse to remain in place. So it was a way out. And so I'd been thinking about studying at different design schools for graduate school, but I also was attracted more to the intellectual side, I guess, the history, the theory of design. And so I knew that would make sense studying that as a graduate rather than I felt completely solid. I could go out and practice graphic design. So I wasn't going to grad school to learn how to be a designer. I felt like I could do that already because I'd already started doing freelance jobs and stuff like that. So it wasn't less. And then technically it was so superior to anything here at Cranbrook. There's no technical training here. Right. So yeah, it wasn't about any of that. It was really about wanting to understand the field itself better.
And so, were you interested in being a practicing designer at that time, or why did you feel like that kind of intellectual side or the history and the theory was so important that you wanted to keep studying that before you kind of went out into the field?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think I wanted to practice. And I think it's because, I base my work around ideas and concepts. Right. And so, that was a fountain of ideas and concepts, it seemed like new territory too. There was not a lot researched or written about, it felt like. And, and there was a lot of new design happening in the world. This is all pre-internet, of course. So you would only hear about these things in drips and drabs and a random magazine article or something. And then most of the magazines were really conventional. So they didn't offer any kind of, you just get glimmers.
Right, right.
Things are happening in the world and the bigger world. And so that was the other motivation to go to graduate school. And then my faculty had suggested, I had very young faculty who had just come out of graduate school. So they kind of encouraged me to explore the option of graduate school, which again, it was really unusual at the time because most people would just go right into practice.
Right.
Like there's no need for an MFA in graphic design.
It's interesting that you kind of found yourself gravitating towards that at a very young age. And Cranbrook, obviously at that time, so the McCoys were there at the time, right?
Right.
And so that was a very theoretical, like there was a lot of discussion happening there. What was that like for you at that time? And I promise we won't spend this whole conversation talking about your early education, but that kind of early Cranbrook, or not early, but like late 80s, early 90s Cranbrook, I think is such a fascinating time in design history.
Yeah, no, it was, and it's interesting to be back and kind of reflecting on it. But so the mystery of Cranbrook. So Cranbrook. So I mentioned that I studied photography. So it was a double major. So fine art photography, not commercial photography, but art photography, and then graphic design. And then the photography program that I studied in was very theoretical, and it was very for the time, very cutting edge because the people, well, these are all people well known now, but, Cindy Sherman and Barbara Kruger, these were emerging artists at the time. It was not the conventional photography program, although they taught very solid skills and all black and white and color and all that stuff. So I took all of that, but it was a very theoretically driven program. So that's when I was introduced to theory. Okay. Semiotics and structuralism, post-structuralism, at least the first pass of it. Right. So when I went to Cranbrook, I was debating about whether I would get an MFA in photography or if I'd get an MFA in design.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, in the same building, in fact.
Right. Okay.
One floor above each other. And then I had known people, actually I knew more people through photography in Cranbrook than I did design in Cranbrook, actually. I never had a Cranbrook instructor. I think there was one who taught it in my undergrad, but for some reason I never had him, and I don't know why. It just deputy or something. I didn't have him. But when I came to interview, I kind of made the decision that it was going to be design, and that's when I discovered that they were interested in the same kinds of theory out of the design department. Okay. They were very interested that I had already started reading all of this stuff, so it was a way of just jumping into the deep end rather quickly. So at that time, I think it's pretty safe to say that Cranbrook was the most experimental design graphic design program in the world, probably. Yeah. And it was theoretical, but it was all about making stuff, and it was very formally driven, like a very really pushing the envelope of typography, legibility, right, like everything. So, and again, this is all pre-computer because computers weren't introduced here until my last 2 weeks.
Oh, wow. Okay. Okay, of course.
So immediately it landed, and then all hell broke loose. But all sorts of good things happened. But it was all pre-computer. So all of that was just the milieu. Was that there was this really interesting design program happening, and then also it was appealing because it was 2D and 3D design. So the department was made up of graphic designers, but also furniture designers and product designers and interior architects.
Oh, interesting.
So it felt like, well, like this would be an interesting context because I had no like three-dimensional sensibility at all.
Right.
It's all flat. And so I always joke that's like one of the bigger things that I learned here was three-dimensional principles, and to be able to visualize and think three-dimensionally was something I learned here that I didn't have in undergrad.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't realize those were originally one program because they're separated.
Yeah, they're separate now. Yeah, they used to be all one department, and it was a bigger department compared to all the other departments here. So it was like There were
Okay.
24 people total, and then 12 in each of the tracks, basically. So 12 in 2D, 12, or 12 in graphic design, 12 in product design or 3D. And then
interesting.
first year and second year. So there's about 6 people.
Right.
When you break it down, which is kind of remarkable. So it was super difficult to get into the program.
Yeah.
Even then, this is before it hit big time. There were all these articles when I was a student here, and then just after a book came out, and then it really.
Right. I just want to kind of like follow this thread for a second. So when you finished at Cranbrook, then what was the goal, or especially being in that kind of highly experimental, like really practice-based kind of theory?
Yeah.
What comes after something like that?
Well, there were 2 camps basically. I think I was one of the lone members of the second camp, but the primary camp. So the joke was that, of course, no one would employ you.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of what I was trying to ask in a nice way.
Yeah. No, that was hopeless.
Okay.
There would be no one. But it was interesting because what that meant was that you started your own business.
Okay.
So that's why so many Cranbrook people started their own firms.
Right.
Like school. A few went. There was not really much opening in the corporate sector then. It's more open now, but a few people did. Some people went to existing design consultancies, and then a smaller subset was interested in teaching.
Okay.
And so, in fact, I don't know if I was the only one who was interested.
Yeah.
I felt like it at the time. There's probably a couple other people. I mean, we all end up teaching, I think, because I don't know. It's just something in the water here that we just teach because either part-time or full-time. But at the time, it was really not about teaching. Like the McCoys were not like they were done with that.
Oh, interesting.
They had produced so many teachers that they were interested in producing practitioners. So I kind of went against the grain.
Right. Okay.
As a teacher.
And what was it? You mentioned there was kind of something in the water, but the McCoys were kind of interested in practitioners at the time. What was it about teaching that interested you? Because you did go on to teach. I mean, you were the designer in residence at Cranbrook for a short time, and then you were at North Carolina for a while running that program. So did you go right into teaching after that?
I did.
Okay.
I mean, I ended up in Florida, actually, for the first year at Florida State University. They had a very unusual undergraduate program. So I just I left here, and then suddenly I was in charge of a graphic design program.
Okay.
But I had a lot of good training and education from undergrad, so that came in really handy. So yeah, it was. I guess it was the need to kind of continue the kind of I wanted to do 2 things. I wanted to practice. I wanted to keep practicing for sure, and then I wanted to be able to also deal with these ideas, and I was very much interested in education. So when I was teaching full-time, I was also operating a practice full-time.
Okay, that was my next question was, like, were you doing design work at this time also? So what type of work was that? Was that just...
It was almost all for the art sector. So it was all cultural sector work, which again was not a big... now everybody wants to do it and it's highly prized, but back then it was like lowly paid.
Right.
It was designed for a bunch of nonprofits.
Right.
It's not as sexy, I guess.
You were a little ahead of your time on that one.
Yeah. Luckily, that's my story. I'm just like steps ahead.
Yeah.
But so I did all work for freelance work for art galleries and art museums, art catalogs, posters, invitations, brand identity stuff, things like that. And that's how I ended up with the job at the Walker, actually.
Okay. All right. I want to talk about that in a second, but I have one other question about teaching, because I think, again, I don't mean to keep drawing parallels between our 2 careers or our 2 stories, but I felt the same way when I finished at MICA, that I wanted to somehow build a career that continued this research, this experimentation, these things that I was wrestling about and thinking about. And so I kind of didn't want to just go and get another design job, because that's what I had done before grad school. And so I cobbled together some freelance clients and started teaching. And I realized that the teaching kind of actually gave me a way to continue this research in like a really kind of clear way, in that I could kind of take these ideas and kind of put them in the classroom, and allowed me to really think about the work that I was doing in the freelance side and start to see how these things talk to each other. Did you find that being in an academic environment as an educator and running a program like that, was it changing how you thought about graphic design or how you thought about your work kind of specifically?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So the first couple of years in teaching, it was in Florida. Then I was back at my undergrad at Heron for a while, for like a year and a half or 2 years probably. And then, so I was just learning to teach then.
Right.
So when I landed in North Carolina, that was when Meredith Davis brought me in there. And so she's another Cranbrook grad from like decade before me here.
Yeah.
She's, if you know Meredith, she's very, she's pretty rigorous around, she has a very academic bent to the way she teaches.
Right.
And so that was and plus they wanted to start a graduate program, or they had a graduate program, but they wanted to change it.
Okay.
So expand it or something. And then they wanted to build a graphic design department because it was part of product design. It was combined at that time too, which is interesting. So we went there to kind of pull it apart and grow it separately. So that was the beginning of being more conscious. It's also a research-based university,
right?
An art school. So it's kind of under the publisher perish paradigm.
Right, right.
So it became very theoretical then,
Okay.
because of more writing, in other words. There was a whole project around like the Visible Language Project on graphic design history done there. And then I did a huge bibliography project, which was on cultural studies and critical theory, and how it would be the kind of reading list that would inform design.
Oh, interesting.
So, yeah. So that, and then the milieu of North Carolina, because NC State's in Raleigh, which is part of the Triangle.
Right.
So you have Duke University in Durham, and then you have UNC Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So they're all within like 20 or 30 minutes of each other. And so there was a huge theoretical contingent at Duke University. And so that was a way of extending some of the ideas and theories of graduate school.
Okay.
So this is heavy post-structuralist encampment in the U.S. Frederick Jameson was the chair.
Oh, interesting. Wow.
Yeah. Terrell Moy was there. Everyone passed through there too. So it was a really great way of getting, not paying for it.
Right.
Education. So that was informing simultaneously the development of the program, the graduate program in North Carolina. That the part that I taught and developed was around culture. It was basically integrating cultural and material studies into design studio and make.
Interesting. I could talk about that for for the rest of this conversation, because I find that those intersections really interesting. But I won't do that, because this also seems like a good way to transition into the Walker, because now hearing you talk about your teaching work and the kind of professional kind of practice work you were doing, the Walker now hearing this background seems like the perfect way to bring all of these things together under one roof, because it wasn't just, or at least my understanding of it is, it's not just, kind of being a creative director or running the in-house design program, but it's also involves kind of outreach and, bringing in speakers and things like that. So is that kind of how that came about?
Yeah, so I was happy as a clam in North Carolina. I was tenured. I was heading this graphic design department actually at the time, and then I got a phone call out of the blue from Kathy Halbrecht, who was the director at the Walker then, and I guess I'd been recommended by some people, and she was reading some of my writings, and so she's trying to have a conversation. I think it was winter break or something, so I was available, so I went to Minneapolis and we had a nice conversation. And I think it was something about the fear of getting tenure. I mean, I got tenure. I started teaching when I was really young, so yeah. So
Yeah.
it was sort of like, oh, well, am I going to do this the rest of my life? I mean,
Right.
it was a very nice setup in North Carolina, so I could see that wouldn't have been a bad thing. But there was suddenly an opportunity to go into practice full time, and so I kind of jumped at that and said, oh, well, this. If I don't do it now, I might not do it ever. Like so,
Right.
do
And
it.
and it's not just practice. I don't mean to oversimplify this, but it's not just practice, kind of traditional working with clients, but it still brought together all of these things you were thinking about, I imagine, in North Carolina. And as a teacher and as a writer, the Walker kind of has that just built into its DNA, it seems like.
Yeah, I mean they have a really long design tradition, and when I went there, it was still in place. It was oriented towards practice because that's what Kathy wanted it to be. So the in-house operation really grew.
Okay.
And like right before I got there, actually, and then so yeah, taking the reins of that over. There was a connected publishing program at the Walker, so that was
Right.
a really interesting way of expanding my own knowledge base, having to do more with publishing and distribution.
Okay.
So, and then eventually online publishing. But so yeah, everything was kind of just a giant platform. The Walker was a giant platform in which to do some of that. And I think I told them in the interview that, well, I'm giving up tenure and a professorship. Just can't pick color chips all day or something. I'll just go insane. So I need some intellectual things to do. And so they said, oh, well, you could do a show now and then. And I was like, oh, that sounds fun.
Okay. I mean, because that was going to be my next question is, did you kind of go into that with an ambition to move into curating and publishing? And it sounds like you did, or that there was some of that there.
Maybe some subliminal seeds. And my main motivation was to enter practice.
Okay.
And then I just kind of wanted some, windows to go through, like setting up some possibility around curating, setting up some possibility around publishing.
Right.
So those things just became kind of more manifest as the years went on. So the first shows were like more into researching the Walker's own history and place in design history, which had been kind of forgotten about and written out of a lot of history books. So that was kind of the first thing I did. So it was very kind of bookish.
Oh, interesting.
Or historical kind of research in the beginning, but then manifested into a show, which was well received. So then it becomes easier to do the next one
right.
than the next one. And then I just learned the kind of practical business of being a curator, like what that meant, how the process works, and
and
kind
so
of on-job training.
right. And I don't mean I could talk about Walker stuff forever. The graphic design now in production show was very important to me when it came out. I was living in New York. I think I had been out of school for a year, was working in New York, and so I saw the show on Governor's Island, and I think that is what planted the seeds that 6 years after that I would go back and go to grad school, because I was kind of, that helped me see these other ways of practice. And so your time at the Walker has been very, whether it's that show or whether it's the writing or the Insight series, has been very influential in my own design education. And so I don't mean to gloss over all of it, but I would love to hear you talk about the kind of evolution of your role there, kind of going in as design director, starting to do some curating. I know you were kind of running all of communication for a while or something like that, and then you became a full-time curator. Can you talk about just that? I realize that's a huge question that's spanning 15 years of your career, but I would love to just kind of hear about how those things came about, or your kind of interest in expanding your own role there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's not something I anticipated necessarily.
Okay.
So the design department, as I was saying, was at the Walker is really unusual for a museum, even today, I think, because almost everything is done in-house.
Right.
So there's a lot of opportunity, but there's also a lot of responsibility. Luckily, I kind of had this basic training in design, and so issues of marketing and things like that are not foreign at all to me, and that surprises some people.
Right. Yeah.
It can be like practical and strategic, but that's just part of my DNA. So when I took over the design department started playing a bigger role in like what we eventually call like brand management. So like, what is the message? What is the strategy? And so it just grew. And so we found ourselves just having to, your combo agency. So it's like we had a marketing department there too that was very good and supportive of that for the most part.
Yeah, that sounds familiar.
Yeah, pretty good overall. Yeah, I think. So the campaigns grew and the budgets grew, and the scope of everything grew, and so it was natural to kind of take on a kind of centralized communications role, whereas basically as chief communications officer. So really thinking at a high level, and you see this in a lot of designers have that capability.
Right.
Anyone who runs a company basically has to deal with this stuff. So it's was just an opportunity that came along. That was, maybe it's only unusual because I was a designer and came out of design and not necessarily marketing. But I fully feel very conversant with all the basics and all the practicalities that go into marketing. So it was just kind of a natural evolution to me. And then that became also about social media and online publishing eventually. Right. So the worlds start coming together, kind of like advancing the storyline. Like 2008 or so, we were very successful at publishing catalogs as an independent publisher, which is also unusual for a museum to have that kind of role.
Yeah.
Which just allows, again, more responsibility, but also more freedom to be able to, generate sales. And so that is also part of it. So there's a whole underbelly or understory of why design can be successful at the Walker. And I hope it's because we inculcated the fact that it needs to perform. And so when it performs, the aesthetics are of secondary importance actually, because, it's the natural taste making function of any designer is to assume the aesthetic role. So those are all just part and parcel of being responsible in a holistic sense for the projects that get done.
Yeah. It's interesting. And I as I've talked to designers who are kind of operating at that level, and even when I was working in-house at larger companies and my career was kind of moving up, I found that more and more of my time was spent not doing the creative stuff and was doing the thinking about the strategy and the budget and things like that, and that just kind of wasn't really what I was interested in at the time. I actually think now I'd be much more interested in that. And I'm curious kind of how you felt about that, and was that kind of intellectual side, you mentioned the aesthetics can sometimes be secondary important, which I agree with, but what about that kind of intellectual side when you were in that role? Did you find, was that kind of fulfilling intellectually?
Yeah. I I kind of conceptualized the design department differently.
Okay.
And maybe some others, because I had taught for like a decade or so at least. I always thought of my role as I'm here to make good design happen.
Oh, that's interesting.
And that was so pervasive because that's the legacy that I inherited from the Friedmans. That they're like the Eameses. They were, like design should be every place. It's like how you place a chair in a room. It's like what the postcard looks like. It's all part of the same problem. So it's so when you come at it from that angle, I just thought my job was dealing with going to endless meetings.
Okay.
figuring out endless budgets, figuring out strategy, but trying to enable a culture where good design can happen.
Mm-hmm.
So as long as the good design was being done, it didn't have to be me doing it. Like I was trying to facilitate that to happen. And it's not that I don't care about form. I'm a big formalist, so I'll tell you in seconds what's wrong with
Right. Yeah.
or why your type sucks, or this is not very interesting because it's just copycat stuff.
Yeah.
Keep a general awareness of what's happening in contemporary design, so that I can have a conversation with the designer that's much more like you would have with maybe a grad student or a student in school. Yeah, I know your tricks, and so maybe we're tired of them now.
Right.
We should push it and do something different. Or here's an opportunity to do something different.
Yeah.
Thought about this. So it's just kind of this instigator kind of role partly, and then also trying to be encouraging of what can happen in the studio. And then also just liking to collaborate with people, because that's also what, that's like working with Ellen on that show was a curatorial collaboration, or working with Emmett Byrne, who's the new design director. We worked together on many catalog projects, and I just like working with interesting people who have their own ideas, and then how do you negotiate all of that stuff is just, I find that kind of fun.
Right. Yeah.
And I know that a lot of designers don't, but I kind of like that process of being really open-ended and just wanting to see where you end up, and trusting that it'll be good.
Yeah. I love that.
It's very scary. It's real risk taking, I think, but it's like, I don't know. It works out most of the time, I think.
Right. Yeah. Most of the time.
Most of the time, it's fine. Yeah.
And then, so I want to kind of take what you're talking about and start to connect that to what you're doing now, because your last couple years at the Walker, you had moved into full-time curating, right?
Yeah, the last, at least, probably 2 years. I forget now.
Okay. And so
we did all this other stuff too, which explains why I'm an administrator. So we ran a whole division that was centered around audience engagement.
Okay.
Strategies and stuff. And so that's just a whole nother thing as administrator. But the kind of transition here, I guess, is what you're like.
Yeah. I mean, I guess kind of my question is, or maybe the question behind the question is, you're working as this, chief communication officer, where you're kind of working in strategy, and tell me if this is wrong. I'm kind of talking about your career as someone who's watched it from the outside, so it might not be like this, but you're kind of working in this strategy, communication, publishing role, and then it seems like you had kind of moved into more of your time was spent curating, and then and you're kind of leaving some of that quote unquote design or practice again, and now moving into being director at Cranbrook. It seems like it's kind of further away from that.
Right. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
Okay.
The inconsistencies in my career. So yes, I became more or less a full-time curator. I still manage some other things administratively.
Okay.
But I was doing some really major projects at the time, like Hippie Modernism,
right.
With like 7 years of research. So all of those things had a major show. So that had to all come in a book. So all of that had to come together. So I had to do more or less full time on that for a year. Okay. So yeah, but I've been curating since basically 2000. So I've been consistently curating kind of my spare time.
Right.
And I still curate here. So I'm kind of more like a curator and a director here because we're a smaller museum. So that's also appealed. So it's kind of, there's administration for sure here at a really high level, but then there's also just curating projects like the one I just finished on punk.
Right.
It's a project that started at the Walker. But it never manifested anything there, really. It's just an idea for me,
Okay.
So it goes back and forth. And so those ideas about, I see design in everything, but that's kind of in my training. So it's like, I'm an editor. I can edit, I can write, I can lay out stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just all part of just a skill toolbox, kind of, is how I think about it. Or strategy is the same way. It's just all the skills that you have to have to kind of survive in the world, I think, these days.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of what my next question was going to be. And I'm asking this question somewhat selfishly, as somebody, I'm basically asking for career advice, maybe, because what's interested me about your career and even what you're just talking about, and let me make sure that I frame this question the right way. I basically have kind of two questions here, because what has interested me about your work is this kind of moving back and forth between, kind of academia or maybe the intellectual side to very kind of practice-based, to back to a little bit more strategy and administration, to back to curating, which seems a little bit more creative and maybe closer to design, to now back to something that involves a lot of administration. I'm interested in how you see design in all of those, which you just started answering, and how the relationships between design and editing, or design and writing, and design and curating.
Right.
And how you see those kind of connections between all of those.
Yeah. So I guess they're in different pieces. Like, so writing, of course, is closely tied to editing. Mm-hmm. Not that all good writers are good editors, but that you have to, as an editor, you have to have a meta level sense of what's going on, right, in a text, or that folds into having more of this marketing kind of experience. Yeah. So like, what are you trying to say, and how are you saying it? Who's the audience? And so just having more nuance to be able to, sometimes I think I'm schizophrenic or something. Like marketing language, which is very different than writing, an essay and a catalog that's basically historical or theoretical. It's just a different forms of writing. But it's kind of like design, where you would have different, not styles, but you just have different approaches depending on what the content is. Right. So there's a lot of inherent flexibility. It's not like, I just do one thing. So I'm certainly not a novelist or something.
Right. Yeah.
So there's a parallel connection, I think, to design that way. And then also just having studied design, and it was like, if you could solve any problem, because it was presented to me as problem solving. Yeah, me too. So I'm not deterred by any size problem. Like, it's just issues of scale and complexity. So it's unraveling all of these problems. And sometimes the problems are administrative problems. Sometimes they're systems problems, which is a little closer to design. So it's like the act of designing is really arranging and ordering, structuring things. So not surprisingly, I take a more structural approach to the things I would design, or how I think through a problem.
Yeah.
So those are all very much like, I guess you would call it design thinking today, but like, it's just what you do as a designer is how you research things, how you unpack problems, and how you creatively try to solve these problems.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I have two questions around that, and one of them is probably a very oversimplified question that you've probably answered many times. And so the first question is, I think you're the first museum director that I've talked to. And so my first question is, what does a museum director do? And then the second question is, I imagine that there are not many museum directors who come from a design background. And you started answering this a little bit, but do you think kind of having that design background allows you to approach that job differently?
Oh, I think so, for sure. Okay. That's what I imagine. I mean, right. Maybe I'm deluding myself. No, because I think let's see, how I'm unusual. I think also because I've worked what I call both sides of the aisle. So I'm curator, because most directors come out of curatorial.
Right.
But I also, worked in design, education, new media, marketing, public relations, technology. Other side of the museum services, kind of creative services, whatever you want to call it, side of the divide. There's less divide now, but in the past there was more. So that already in and of itself is really unusual. So there's that advantage. What did museum directors do? They manage up to their board of directors and their supervisors if they have those, and they manage down in terms of staff. So it's a two-pronged kind of management problem. And then how here it's just a little bit different because we're so much smaller than the Walker. So it feels more like a design studio, or kind
interesting.
of curator would say more like a gallery or something.
Right.
Everyone's just more scrappy, and everyone does 2 or 3 jobs like you do in a studio.
Yeah.
So there's that. So I feel like that there's a certain familiarity with how to solve problems, because we do very kind of ambitious things here with a very small staff. So, but it doesn't freak me out too much because I think I've seen that small staffs do a lot. So
Yeah.
I guess I have confidence that something good will happen at the end of it. Yeah. Whereas if you have a very large organization, it's a different kind of management problem. It's like juggling spinning plates, basically. Right. To keep everything going forward. And then there's fundraising activities and all of that too. That's part of the director's job, and you're kind of the public face of the institution. So there's that.
I'm curious kind of hearing you talk about that. And, as we kind of went through your background, the role of writing in your work today, and is that something that kind of still fits into your work, or has writing changed for you? Because like I said, I've been reading you for years, and I'm kind of curious how that fits into this new role.
That's a good question. I think the simpler answer would be mostly through the curatorial project. The speaking could be more of a 50-50 thing, where it might be talking about something that relates to an exhibition, or it could just be about kind of contemporary museum strategies around communications or publishing or audience engagement or even curatorial strategy. So it's more varied when it comes to public speaking, but for writing it tends to be, because it just takes longer to do that. So those tend to be those curatorial exhibition related projects, or if I'm a guest curator or something, or part of a team on another project, then usually write something and then do research on that. The research is also part of it. So as a curator, I'm researching constantly for upcoming shows, writing that goes into that eventually.
Okay. I asked you the inverse of this question earlier about kind of coming from a graphic design background and how that, kind of affects, or influences the job you have now. But I'm kind of curious about the inverse. And does, as your career has evolved, has it changed how you think about graphic design, or how you work with graphic designers, or kind of what you even, want from graphic design?
To a certain degree. I mean, gosh, that's an interesting question. I haven't really thought of it. Like, how does it affect it? Well, I mean, it's still, I think my expectations for a graphic designer is still similar to what they were at the Walker, in terms of like, uncompromising. Not that we fulfill it, but we can always try. It has got to be smart. It's got to be beautiful, and it's got to be, it needs to perform. So it needs to be all of those things.
Yeah.
And on budget. But other than that, no problem. It's so the demand, the level of expectation is still the same. Although, you just have to live with fewer things, and it's I don't have the same staff, so it's a little bit of a struggle there. But it's still good. It's just not the same, but it's not the same. So why would you expect it to be the same?
Right.
It's kind of silly expectation. So I think it's just, it has more to do with, I was trying to think of like how administration, certainly strategy is what I've been doing a lot of lately.
Yeah.
Strategic planning, initiatives, frameworks, those things are just part of, I was participating in all of them at the Walker as well, and have done that for other organizations too. It's just something that kind of comes natural after a while. It becomes more familiar.
Yeah.
I don't know if that has had a big impact on design. I think through the design implications of how to fit into those plans, and sometimes it's by subject, sometimes it's through methodology. We're trying to figure out here within our own education program how we deal with the concept of design thinking, since everyone talks about it and wants it.
Right.
Can it be different if it's actually taught by designers?
Right. Yeah. That is a topic that seems to come up in these conversations a lot, actually. So I know what you mean.
Yeah, because I had a good education, so I had design methods classes and things like that. So and so naturally, there's a bit of skepticism, but also at the same time, like, well, what can we learn about that? How can it apply? Because if you're trying to spread design out into the larger world, which is the big difference about working at a museum, you're in a public space. It's not. So your impact can be much broader. The people you come in contact with are cross sections of the public. So, so it's just part of the mission to put forward, this is good design. This is good design thinking. This is good strategy, just trying to create a platform for that kind of stuff to happen. And hopefully they'll connect the dots, which I was happy about being in Minneapolis for that long, because it does affect, I think, the culture of the city. To be able to see, like, when they have something like the Walker to point to, and certainly the Walker wasn't the only one, even museum-wise, but that there's a conversation happening in the public realm about design, or people can see the design happening. They may not always like it, but at least it's kind of forefronted.
Speaking of that, this is something that I was really curious to ask you about. When you mentioned kind of being your time at Cranbrook as a student, and there was a lot of intellectual activity happening at the time, and we've talked about how you've written for all of these publications over the years. I'm curious kind of how you think the design discourse has changed over your career, and as someone who kind of came into it when it was almost non-existent, just starting, to the huge output of it in the 90s, to kind of blogs, to kind of where we are today. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it's kind of, it's such a different world.
Yeah.
Right? It was basically through magazines back in the day.
Right.
And they went through their turmoil. Now I guess they're all folded or something.
Yeah.
There's the online, so everything's much more instantaneous. Trends tend to be more global instead of regional or even national.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so there's a kind of for better or worse, it's kind of an international style.
Yeah.
Style of graphic design that operates today. So it's both. It's encouraging on the one hand, then discouraging on another. I guess because if it's too available, it seems too easy, maybe. And there's not enough resistance to it or enough evolution within it. The machine just wants to absorb every new tick.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So that's can be kind of annoying, maybe, or it's not annoying. It's just a fact. It's just whereas in the past, because there was such a delay in how ideas would get out in the world, you'd have more time with your ideas and concepts before they would be instantaneously transmitted around the world. So you could spend more time with it and hone it. Whereas it just seems to get passed along, and then I guess as a collective it gets honed.
Right.
Yeah, it's because something that's kind of just crossed my mind lately, but the evolution of form. We were traditionally as curators framing that as an individual experience, meaning that the author or the artist was really in charge of that. But
right.
because of the dissemination, it becomes more of a collective enterprise.
Right.
So then how do you, questions of originality, innovation, et cetera, just become kind of either irrelevant or they take on a different flavor because of the dynamic that's happening. You see that in art as well, although they'll deny it, but
yeah.
Definitely in the art world you see these things too. So so I think that's something that's definitely different from the past in terms of the level of discourse. I think there's a lot of interesting projects. So doing the graphic design now in production, and we kind of unearthed that was kind of not the beginnings, but there was a lot of activity around individual designers publishing books on designers or doing research. And so that's kind of heartening that there's a base level of research that's in publishing that's happening now, because we've kind of gone through the first wave maybe of the survey approach, and we can dig deeper into these other areas. Other topics just kind of reoccur. So if you've been around long enough, because I was the first paper I published was we used to call it multiculturalism back then.
Interesting.
And then now the discourse around decolonization is not it's different but not dissimilar, and so or just about voice and representation and the kinds of debates and discussions that were happening back then in the 90s versus now is both similar and different. So maybe there's some continuity, there's some advancement in thinking, and certainly there's a broader base of support around those notions. Like, if I think I once called graphic designs patriarchal.
Yeah, totally. And that's another topic that has come up on this podcast multiple times. So I think you're exactly right.
It just seems like people being offended back then, but it's much more embraced today. I think that kind of perspective, or that why are you trying to form a canon of Western design?
Right.
Or just be conscious of the fact that you are. I'm not necessarily opposed to canon formation. Conscious of what you're doing. So there's kind of sympathy towards that. So I guess I don't have like a lot of nostalgia. I think there's a lot happening. It's hard to keep up with. That there's not there's many more outlets, so it's harder to be attuned to everything.
Right. That leads perfectly into my last question, and this is a question that I ask everybody to kind of wrap these up, and we've talked about some of these things already, but I'm kind of curious about what your we talked about this kind of intellectual interest around design that you've had basically your whole career. I'm kind of interested in what you're thinking about right now, or who are some of the people that you're reading right now, or what's kind of on your mind, or people that you're kind of looking to?
Oh, well, these days it's all driven by whatever project I'm working on.
I imagined that, yeah.
So I've got two extremes. So I'm working on two major projects. One is a kind of history of the Cranbrook Academy of Art.
Oh, great.
And so that one, I became interested in it because I've always been interested in pedagogies, or sort of unconventional pedagogies. And part of that has to do with maybe some remnants of that from the hippie modernism show.
Yeah, I see that.
Yeah. And so it seemed like when I landed here, no one's done anything really since maybe the mid 80s and about the history of the place. And it's we just take it for granted because it's been around 85 years, but it was a radical educational experiment. And it's the only one to have survived.
Right. Yeah.
For that long. So, which is kind of interesting. So I'm taking that kind of approach to it. And so I've been doing a lot of localized research in a way, digging deep into the history of the organization. And then looking at all of these amazing people that it's graduated. It also has never had a specific stylistic school. The design department closest, I think, and maybe some parts of architecture at certain times. But basically, it's kind of a very individualized approach. So it's hard to categorize. I resist all those different categories. So I find that kind of interesting. And then what am I reading right now? I'm reading.
I know, that's always a hard question.
Right. Well, it just sounds so esoteric and weird, but I'm currently reading.
That's what this podcast is all about.
I'm reading a Dutch futurologist, one of the earliest ones. And that's for a show that I'm working on. It's a consortium show, so I'm just kind of a guest curator with that. It's about kind of design in the future. So I'm looking at the role of images and in our conception, or how do images of the future form our consciousness of the future. Right. So that's the esoterics. I'm reading his dissertation.
That is so interesting. Andrew, thank you so much for this conversation. Like I said, I've been reading your writing for basically as long as I've been interested in design, and have followed your career fairly closely, and have been looking forward to talking to you for a while. And this was so great, and I'm just really glad we got to do this. And like I said, I'm a fan. So thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Well, thank you for asking me, and thanks for reading me all these years. I'm never sure who reads me. So. Oh yeah.
This episode was recorded on August 7th, 2018. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, SoundCloud, and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.